In the year 1967, deep within the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, a construction crew stumbled upon something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about human memory, time, and the nature of existence itself. What they found wasn't gold or ancient artifacts. It was a man, if we can call him that, living in complete darkness, speaking a language that predated recorded history, and claiming to remember things that happened before the sun first rose over our world. This is the story of Brother Thaddeus, the monk who said he had walked among shadows when the earth knew only endless night, who remembered the faces of creatures that moved in that primordial darkness, and whose final confession would shake the very foundations of a monastery that had stood for 800 years. But before I tell you what he claimed to have seen in those lightless eons, let me warn you, some memories are too ancient, too terrible, to be contained within the fragile walls of human sanity. The discovery began with screams echoing from beneath the mountain. Workers had been excavating for a new railway tunnel when their drill broke through into what they initially believed was a natural cave system. The foreman, a man named Constantin Dragoi, later described the sound that emerged from that hole as not quite human, but not quite animal either. Something caught between the two, like a voice that had forgotten how to be either. When they lowered a lamp into the darkness, they saw him. Naked, emaciated beyond belief, his skin pale as ancient parchment, crouched in the center of what appeared to be a perfectly circular chamber carved from the living rock. His hair hung in matted ropes to his waist, white as fresh snow, despite his apparent youth, but it was his eyes that haunted the workers, most completely devoid of pupils. Milky white orbs that somehow seemed to track their movements, despite their obvious blindness. The man, for lack of a better word, was speaking continuously in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence. The language was unlike anything the workers had heard before. It predated Latin, predated Greek, predated everything in their collective linguistic memory. Professor Andrei Cosmescu from the University of Bucharest would later describe it as if such a thing could exist, a language so ancient, it seems to bypass human evolution entirely. But here's where the story takes its first truly disturbing turn. The chamber where they found him wasn't just carved, it was decorated. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight, depicting scenes that made no sense according to everything we know about the history of our planet. There were images of vast cities under starless skies, of creatures with too many limbs walking among humans, of rituals being performed around what could only be described as doorways to nowhere. Most unsettling of all were the faces carved into the stone, hundreds of them, each unique, each bearing expressions of such profound terror that several of the construction workers refused to return to the site. The faces weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They possessed a familiarity that scratched at the back of the mind like a half-remembered nightmare. The local authorities, perhaps wisely, decided this was beyond their expertise. The man who would soon become known as Brother Thaddeus was delivered to the monastery of the Sacred Sepulchre, a remote Orthodox monastery that had stood in the region since the 12th century. The monks were known for their work with the mentally disturbed, though they had never encountered anything quite like this. Father Dimitri, the monastery's elder, was the first to make contact with the strange man. In his private journals, discovered decades later, he wrote, "He speaks as though he has witnessed the birth of time itself, and his words carry the weight of eons. I find myself believing him, though such belief threatens the very core of my faith." He says he remembers when the world was dark, when different things walked the earth, when the sun was nothing more than a cold star among countless others in an empty sky. The monks named him Thaddeus, after Saint Thaddeus, who was said to have preached in the darkest corners of the world, but the name never seemed to fit him properly, as though he carried an older identity that could not be overwritten by mere human designation. For the first several months, Thaddeus would do nothing but sit in the monastery's darkest corners, continuing his endless recitation in that impossible language. The monks tried to teach him Romanian, then Latin, then Greek, any language that might serve as a bridge to communication. But gradually, they realized that Thaddeus was teaching himself their languages by listening to their conversations. absorbing words with a speed that bordered on supernatural. When he finally began to speak in recognizable words, what he said chilled them to the bone. "I remember the time before the burning wheel rose in the sky," he told Father Dimitri during their first actual conversation. "I remember when we moved freely between the layers of the world, when the barriers were thin, when the things that sleep now walked among us as brothers. I remember their faces, all their faces, and they remember mine." Father Dimitri, a learned man who had studied theology for 40 years, found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask. "How long?" he whispered. "How long have you been alive?" Thaddeus tilted his head, those milk-white eyes seeming to focus on something beyond the monastery walls, beyond time itself. "Since the first breath drew darkness into itself, since the first thought formed in the cooling mind of the world, I have been here since the things that are no longer learned to speak, and I will be here when the last light dies." But it wasn't just his claims of ancient memory that disturbed the monks, it was his knowledge. Despite having no access to books or education, Thaddeus possessed an intimate understanding of subjects that shouldn't have existed when he claimed to have lived. He could describe geological formations in terms that wouldn't be developed until the 18th century. He spoke of the movement of continents, of ice ages that came and went, like seasons, of species that had risen and fallen before humanity ever drew breath. Most unnervingly, he could describe the monastery itself in perfect detail, not as it existed in 1967, but as it had been built, stone by stone, in the year 1184. He knew the names of craftsmen who had been dead for nearly 800 years. He could recite conversations that had taken place in chambers that had been sealed for centuries. "I watched them build this place," he told the increasingly frightened monks. "I watched from the shadows of the forest, knowing that one day I would need to shelter here, knowing that one day the wheel of light would complete its turn and I would need sanctuary from what was coming." The other monks began to notice changes in themselves. Those who spent time with Thaddeus reported vivid, disturbing dreams filled with impossible architectures and faces that weren't quite human. Brother Marcus, the monastery's librarian, began speaking fragments of that ancient language in his sleep. Brother Pavel developed a condition where he could only see clearly in complete darkness, his eyes gradually losing their ability to process natural light. But it was Brother Vossel who experienced the most dramatic change. After spending 3 days transcribing Thaddeus's recollections, Vossel emerged from his cell, claiming he could remember things that had never happened to him. Memories of walking through cities that existed before the pyramids, of participating in rituals under alien constellations, of speaking with beings that wore human faces like masks. Father Dimitri, recognizing the danger, attempted to limit Thaddeus's contact with the other monks. But the damage, if we can call it that, had already been done. The entire monastery had become infected with something, whether it was madness or memory. None of them could say. Thaddeus seemed to sense their growing fear, and his recollections took on a more urgent tone. "The wheel turns," he would say repeatedly. "The burning wheel completes its circuit, and the time of darkness returns. They are waking in their deep places. They remember the agreements made before the first sunrise. They remember what was promised when the light agreed to rule the day." According to Father Dimitri's journals, Thaddeus began to describe specific events that he claimed were approaching. He spoke of cities that would sink into the earth, of waters that would turn black, of a time when the sun would begin to flicker like a dying candle. But most terrifying were his descriptions of the things that would emerge when the darkness returned. "They have been waiting," he said during one of his final recorded conversations. "Patient, dreaming, in the spaces between spaces. They remember when the world belonged to them, when humanity was just another animal to be herded and harvested. They remember the taste of our fear, the sound of our prayers to gods who were never meant to hear them." But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Thaddeus's presence at the monastery was his effect on time itself. Clocks would run backwards in his vicinity. Calendars would show dates that had never existed. The monks began to age at different rates, some growing younger, others older, all of them changing in ways that defied natural law. Brother Marcus documented one particularly unsettling incident in his private notes. I found Thaddeus standing before a mirror in the chapel, but his reflection showed not his current form, but dozens of different versions of himself, some younger, some older, some barely human at all. When I asked him about this, he simply said, "I am all the moments I have been, all the faces I have worn. Time is not a river for me, it is an ocean, and I swim in all its depths simultaneously." The end came in the winter of 1971, 4 years after Thaddeus's discovery. Father Dimitri found him one morning in the monastery's oldest chamber, the one that had been sealed since the 13th century. The locks were intact, the stone walls showed no signs of forced entry, yet there he was, standing before a crude altar that the monks had no memory of building. "It is time," Thaddeus said, without turning around. "The wheel completes its turn. The agreements must be honored. The darkness remembers its children." Father Dimitri later wrote that the chamber seemed to be growing darker despite the presence of his lamp, as though light itself was being consumed by something unseen. On the altar lay what appeared to be a book, though its pages were made of a material that wasn't quite paper, wasn't quite skin, wasn't quite stone. "This is the record," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce, "the memory of what was, what is, what will be again. The faces of those who walked before the first sunrise, the names of those who will walk after the last sunset. Your people have forgotten, but forgetting and not being forgotten are very different things." He turned then, and Father Dimitri saw that Thaddeus's milk-white eyes were no longer empty. They held depths that seemed to go on forever, filled with movement, filled with faces, filled with scenes of a world that existed in the spaces between seconds. "I have been the keeper of what came before," Thaddeus continued, "but my watch is ending. The wheel turns, the darkness rises, and they call to me from the deep places where they have waited so patiently. It is time for me to go home." According to Father Dimitri's final entry, Thaddeus began to fade as he spoke, becoming translucent, becoming shadow, becoming something that existed more in memory than in physical space. His last words were spoken in that ancient language, but somehow Father Dimitri understood them. "The faces remember. The darkness remembers. And when the wheel stops turning, when the burning light finally dies, they will remember you too." The monastery was abandoned 3 days later. The remaining monks scattered to other religious communities, but none of them ever spoke publicly about what they had experienced. Father Dimitri died 6 months later, but not before hiding his journals in a place where they wouldn't be found for decades. The chamber where Thaddeus disappeared was sealed. Then the entire monastery was condemned and left to the elements. But local shepherds report that on certain moonless nights, you can still hear that rhythmic chanting echoing from the ruins. Still see lights moving through windows in buildings that no longer have roofs. The book that Thaddeus left on the altar was never found. Some say it dissolved when exposed to daylight. Others claim it was taken by the authorities and locked away in archives that don't officially exist. But a few whisper that it's still there, in that sealed chamber, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to read the memories of things that lived before the sun learned to burn. In 1993, a team of archaeologists attempted to explore the ruins. They found the chamber, though they had to break through concrete barriers that weren't on any official building records. The altar was there, empty except for a single symbol carved into its surface, a symbol that seemed to shift and change, depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Professor Alina Askew, who led the expedition, reported that her team experienced what she diplomatically termed shared hallucinations while in the chamber. They saw faces in the walls, heard voices in languages that predated human speech, felt the presence of something vast and patient watching them from the darkness between the stones. The expedition was terminated early, and the chamber was sealed. Again, this time with steel and concrete, and prayers in languages both ancient and modern. But Professor Georgescu's private notes, recently made available through her estate, contain a disturbing addendum. "We didn't find evidence of Brother Thaddeus. We found evidence that Brother Thaddeus found us. I have memories now that aren't mine, of walking through a world lit only by stars, of speaking with things that wore human shapes but weren't human, of participating in ceremonies that welcomed something from the spaces between spaces. I remember faces that lived before the first sunrise, and God help me, they remember me too. The truth about Brother Thaddeus, whether he was a man displaced in time, a guardian of prehistoric memories, or something else entirely, may never be known. But the questions he raised about the nature of memory, time, and the things that existed before recorded history continue to haunt those few brave enough to investigate. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is the one that Father Dimitri hinted at in his final journal entry, that Thaddeus wasn't unique, that he was simply one of many watchers, guardians of memories, too ancient and terrible for ordinary human consciousness to contain. If this is true, then somewhere out there, in caves and forgotten places, in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, others like him wait, and remember and prepare for the turning of the wheel that, according to Thaddeus, was always meant to complete its circuit. The wheel that would bring back the darkness, the old agreements, and the things that remember when the world belonged to them. In the end, perhaps the most frightening thing about the story of Brother Thaddeus isn't what he claimed to remember about the past, but what he promised about the future. Because if he was telling the truth, if he really had lived before the first sunrise, then his departure from our world wasn't an ending. It was a preparation, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, in the deep places where patient things wait and watch and remember, the faces he spoke of are counting down the moments until the wheel completes its turn, until the agreements made in that primordial darkness are finally honored, until the children of the night can come home at last. The monastery still stands, though only its bones remain. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries whispers from times before time, shepherds in the Carpathian Mountains report seeing lights in those empty windows, hearing chants in languages that predate human speech, and sometimes, just sometimes, glimpsing a figure standing among the ruins. Milk-white eyes turned toward the sky, watching and waiting for the wheel to complete its ancient turn. Brother Thaddeus claimed he had seen the world before light existed, that he remembered the faces of things that walked in that darkness. But perhaps the real question isn't whether his memories were real. Perhaps the real question is whether those faces remember us.